There are two buckets, if you will, of where chops and lifts can be valuable. Their setup, the purpose is completely different, even though they look very much the same what you're doing with your arms and upper body. But let's talk about before chops and lifts come into the room, why these things anyway? Well, we like moving in diagonal, but why? One of the several PNF concepts, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, dating back to the 50s or earlier, was a series of principles that appeared to be very helpful, very effective for people with neurological compromise, strokes, etc. Where when we look at chops and lifts, using concepts of a very strong grip, irradiation, using concepts of crossing midline, very, very effective. Not necessarily even knowing why, but we see that when these things happen, I think we also know that concepts and facts related to the corpus callosum and two hemispheres, when we looked at neurological patients where you have one side compromise of the brain affects the other side. So crossing midline, it's kind of like candy, and we see that in performance as well. But also just moving in diagonals in a sequence that is reliable, including the fingers to the elbow, forearm, etc. All of those things can be embodied or at least tried to replicate in what we're trying to accomplish with chops and lifts. Those are things that can be done manually, where if we start to break down, and a lot of physical therapists will know this, but if I am using my right hand and I am moving in this direction, where I would say slap your face, maybe slap your ear, where I would call this diagonal 1, D1 flexion. And then the opposite, where I do need to get behind my body, would be D1 extension. And they are representative. We can look it up. So again, flexion, adduction, etc., supination, and then hand action as well. Okay. Now, if you start to then look, and you would see that there's tremendous utility for what you might think is chops and lifts. If someone's in a sling, we can still accomplish some of these things using only one arm and a cable. Now, what is the other side doing? Is doing diagonal 2, the D2 patterns. So if this is D1, so I would say slap yourself, pet the dog, slap yourself, pet the dog. And look, if you don't do every component, that's also important. You're still accomplishing something. So now D2 would be take something out of your pocket, throw it away. Take something out of your pocket, throw it away. And where you would use your manual contacts, how you would bow. You know, when I learned PNF, I'm not sure it's terribly different. If it is, the concepts are not different. That's where chops and lifts come from. There's huge value as to why they do certain things. Now let's get to those two buckets. If you are using those neurological candy bars to drive stabilization to the lower half, that's really the first step of why maybe you saw years ago where these were options as a term that I don't use, as corrective patterns for certain movements. I would say if that is something that you choose and value, you're taking advantage of shoulders and or thoracic that move well enough to drive stabilization in a static fashion below. And how you would set that up would be based on what pattern you're trying to impact. So if it would be anything that would have some type of split position, if you're looking at active straight leg raise or something that would extend into sprinting, single leg stance, lunge, if you believe you have the mobility, but for some reason the person can't figure out how to do it, one way to step back from a motor skill acquisition standpoint is to get into half kneeling only for those patterns. But in this case, non-negotiable, get rid of your foot. Now, if somebody can't planar flex as well as I can, that's, you have ways to kind of build up the floor. I think you'll see sometimes people like this. That would be a problem because now you're able to use your MTPs, metatarsophalangeal joints, to create stabilization. I don't want any stabilization to come from anything south of the knee. So if I angle this way, my goal of what we'll get to, because you almost don't always have to use chops and lifts. You can use anything that's relatively challenging. It's not going to get you strong because I'm taking away stabilization as we kind of get in line. Okay? And now our goal is to get completely in line, where again, I know if you go back to T equals R1, and if you put the stick there, you're trying to get there, and all of a sudden you don't have to tell someone what to do. They just know not to fall. I'm significantly retroverted, so that's a challenge for me. But if I get in line, all I have is my reflexive hip. My knee is not giving me much. I'm not getting anything again if I'm planar flexed. And now, just standing here, I think you might be able to set a goal of 1 to 2 minutes of just not falling, not moving, not budging. You would qualify that before you even got to chop and lift. And there's exercises before this. This is the 3 position. You would look at things like lower body rolling. You'd look at things like leg lock bridge. You'd look at things like quadruped bent leg raise, which would be lower body extension, stability, motor skill acquisition exercises, special exercises for movement. Now, I don't think you're correcting anything because there's nothing wrong if you don't have pain. You wouldn't be doing any of these things if there was pain in this chain, in this system. Some of the other exercises we would use here with this inline half kneeling, we would just hold in a goblet. We would use potentially 1 arm or 2 arm bottoms up, but then we would go into our chops and lifts where you're only using the upper body to perturb this system right here. This leg's out of the equation. You don't have any kickstand. You're not oblique, etc. There's different rules. Oh, I thought oblique half kneeling was really, really good in that world. Yes, it's very, very good. But, oh, don't do that. It's not centrated. Nonsense. What you're doing is taking this kickstand out, and you're basically standing on one leg without any utility of the foot or the knee. It's all coming at the hip, and it's probably the glute medius training that you're not doing. Other types of exercises that might take advantage of this position is just trying to balance. And you can see I'm not very good at the moment. None of this would work if you are stiff up front, but just working this position and holding as long as you can will have high level of proprioception and awareness for the hip in a general fashion. So that would be the reason, but you would only be using half kneeling, because that's a question that I saw recently. Like, how do you know if you should use half kneeling or tall kneeling? And they answered, you could do whatever. I don't disagree. For the other bucket of anti-rotation, strength, performance, power, etc. But this is more of a motor skill. This is more of a special exercises to drive stabilization in anything that has a split stance. Well, what if it's a squat or a push-up or a jump and you look to turbocharge that? That's where you're in tall kneeling. And again, you're going to take away any opportunity to let your feet be part of the system. I think sometimes putting a yoga block in between or putting something in between, if you're scant, you're going to be able to get as close as you can. That would be the goal. That would be the goal. And we want to be at least neutral or maybe even a little internally rotated so that, again, stabilization strategies on one leg can be awesome. On 2 legs, not so good. Vice versa, any combination. But that's how you would decide if you're going to do chop and lift, and you're doing it as a special exercise to drive motion into the lower half to stabilize, control in the presence of change. That's how you would decide if you're going to use 1 leg versus 2 legs. Now, let's take a middle ground here. We're going to use the Kaiser. You can use anything, but if that is your setup, and then we'll talk about the other setup where it's less important, we're going to go in 4 phases, 3 of which we'll use here. I can't really tell you when you should move on, other than your goals are being achieved and you'll want to continue in that space. You have to decide. Are you looking for some type of arbitrary score on your FMS or other forms of stabilization in your performance? If you're not there yet, but you're not getting any better with level 1, then you'll move on to level 2 or level 3. So level 1.